Hello everyone, and today I have the pleasure in welcoming Alison Allfrey, the author of the new book, So Sweden. Hello Alison.
Hello, and thank you for the chance to speak with you, Jessica.
And I believe you've joined us live from the south of England.
I live just near Winchester, so it's about 40 minutes above the coast, on the southern coast of England.
Good weather today?
It's absolutely stunning. I have to say that during this whole COVID saga, we've been very lucky with the weather. That's one thing, and it's just set fair for days and days. So that's really wonderful and a pick me up.
I think we're all happy when the weather is good. So I understand you moved to Sweden with your family in 2012 and not really knowing very much about this country.
No, that's quite right. So my husband, he's an engineer and he'd been working with Ericsson for quite a long time. And then the next sort of step up for his career was a posting. And so he was posted to the main headquarters of Ericsson in Kista, just outside Stockholm. So we moved, as you say, in 2012 with our two young boys who were 5 and nearly 2 at the time. And but you're right, I didn't know Sweden at all. I'm a really keen traveller, and I've travelled a huge amount, and I studied languages, French and German at university, and I'd lived in France before. But Sweden was entirely new.
Recently, we had the pleasure of hearing your presentation at the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce. And I was wondering then if you possibly could share some of your experiences as an expat here in Sweden with a short presentation.
Well, this photo really sums up Sweden for me. I think it's one of our very favourite places. It's somewhere that we used to take the little boat that we rented, and we used to camp there with the children. And this shows the light and nature and water, and those for me are some of the very most important things of Sweden. So as I said, when we moved to Sweden, I was in an entirely new country with 2 pretty small children, and knowing that we were going for an initial posting of 2 years, I thought. So we took the ferry from the east coast of England up to the west coast of Denmark, and we had all of our belongings in 2 cars and in a removal lorry, and we drove a very, very long way to get up to Stockholm. And this is why I chose this photo, because I had this enormously strong impression as soon as we began on that journey of vastness and emptiness and space such that I had almost never seen, apart from perhaps in Africa as a child. But just such an enormous country, and I felt that I had sort of disappeared into an entirely different world with a landscape that was so unspoiled and so untouched seemingly by humanity. It was really a very sort of strong impression. I think that when we very first arrived in Stockholm, the 2 impressions that I had was one of incredible national pride. Everywhere we went, people said, "So how do you like Sweden?" And it was quite funny in a way, because for me, the Swedes are quite reticent, quite shy people really to start with. They're not going to be in your face, they're not very overt. But I was quite surprised that everybody wanted to know immediately what we thought of their country. And I think the reason for that is that Swedes have this huge national pride, which I think is a very, very positive thing, because I think that in the modern world, some countries, and particularly Britain, we're always being self-deprecating. We never want to boast about our country. We're always finding the faults in it. And so I found it really refreshing to be in a country where people think it's just the most stunning, amazing place. And they always feel very, very positive about it. But as I say here, I did have this feeling of having left the normal world, of having gone on this voyage very, very, very far north. And I wasn't sure how it was going to turn out. It was really quite daunting to start with. I think that a lot of people just have a very, very positive impression of the Swedes, which I share. But I think because they have that very sort of unquestioning impression, they don't perhaps realise how different the Swedes are to other nationalities. And if I've tried to analyse this in my mind many times since leaving, and also whilst we were there, and what is it that makes them quite so different? Well, I think that the climate is a big factor in conditioning the Swedish mindset and how people behave in different seasons and how they spend their time. And I think that it's such a big factor because it's such an extreme climate, obviously, and the winters are so very long, and there's also the absence of light. that it makes people almost behave like animals. And I don't mean that in any way in a derogatory way. I simply mean that you're very conditioned by, you know, either in the summer having endless light and really making absolute most of it and exercising and enjoying yourselves and partying all of the time, or really hibernating in the winter because it's very tough. So that's something that's very marked, these very distinct seasons. I think another thing that I've very much noticed about Swedes is quite how humble and restrained they are. There's very much this sense that people shouldn't exaggerate things. You mustn't puff yourself up. You mustn't make more of yourself than is the truth. And that's summed up in this excellent word lagom, which is just, you know, sort of moderation in everything, and all will be well. And I think too that the Swedes are very self-sufficient. In Britain, we've got to the stage that if it snows in the winter, nobody who owns a shop will actually clean outside the front of their shop for fear of being sued if somebody falls over, which is really the nanny state gone completely mad. And in Sweden, it's quite the opposite, where people are hugely self-sufficient. And as we know, many Swedes have second homes in the archipelago, and they go there in the summer. And as a British person arriving in Sweden, I thought that sounded really quite sort of smart, because in Britain it's quite ostentatious to have a second home. It means you're very rich and it's a particular sort of niche of society. But in Sweden, no, there are these idyllic small wooden houses in the archipelago, and people will be mending them as their summer holiday because people must do things for themselves. And I think that's an enormous strength. I think that Sweden is a very liberal place, perhaps versus Britain. And I think we've seen that, interestingly, in the reaction to COVID, because in Britain, we've been told exactly what we must do. And I think in Sweden, fascinatingly, the population has been left more to its own devices to make an adult decision. So it's much more liberal than Britain in a way. And I think that there's huge egalitarianism, both between different classes of people, and those classes exist in a much less noticeable way in Sweden, and also between the sexes. And I noticed that with friends that we had, actually with Swedish friends, but funnily enough also with sort of German or Belgian friends that we had, that the relationship between the sexes in marriages is really quite different to how it is in Britain. Introversion I've put here, which I think is it's an interesting point, and I think it pertains to Swedes, particularly in the winter, where they've got this sort of mode of survival, and they go out and exercise and wrap up very warm, and then you get back to all this coziness and all of the candles and warmth and maybe the odd cinnamon bun or two. But people keep themselves to themselves, and then suddenly they erupt as soon as the sun comes out. And I remember watching people by the Stadshuset in Stockholm sunbathing with gay abandon in April, and I couldn't quite work out why. And then I realized that the sun is such a precious thing that people really don't want to miss any moment of it. So the seasons are hugely important, and I think that's a lovely sort of rhythm that gives people something to follow throughout the year. So how to enjoy a different country? I think there are probably two steps to this. I suppose that realistically, in your first year, you are being assailed by lots of different influences, things that you're not used to, food that's different, the huge expense of living in Sweden, the preparations for the winter, be that talking your children up in the right ski suits to getting your studded tyres for your cars, and all of these things. There's a huge amount coming at you that you need to get used to. So there is that initial phase where you have to just pace yourself and try to keep calm and try to realize that you're actually in a hugely sort of stressful and different situation, and that everything that you knew has been turned upside down. So I suppose you move from that almost sort of survival instinct to then thinking a few months down the line, depending, I think, on who you meet. And we've spoken, Jessica, about the need for one really good ally and one really strong friend to get you feeling happy and confident. And once you're in that position, then I think you think, well, how am I actually going to get the most out of this country? I think you have to throw yourself into everything. I'm lucky I have a very adventurous husband who's always very positive and bouncing around. And I think our intention was just to see as much of Sweden and the area as we could, and to do everything that we couldn't do at home. So I think that's a really good thing to try to do. Don't pretend that you're at home, but look at the country that you're in and see what makes you tick and what you might be interested in. I think also when you're living abroad, you're not really caged in. When I'm in Britain, you know, I studied languages, I've done a particular job, you're always pigeonholed in particular things. And I think that makes you feel that that's your sort of area of operation and you can't really go outside it. But suddenly when you move abroad, you don't really feel like that, because if something doesn't exist, then you can create it and no one's going to judge you, and you're in a very sort of fluid and fast moving expat environment. So I think that's very exciting. And I had friends who were very entrepreneurial, importing different products from their home countries, or I set up singing classes and I set up a culture club to get my friends from the British school in Djursholm really to enjoy everything that Stockholm had to offer. So I think there's very much the challenge of if it's not there, then create it and go with it. I think that learning the language, I am a linguist, so of course I'm biased, but I really truly feel that if you're going to live in somebody else's country, you need to make a lot of effort towards that culture, and you need to embrace it, to feel positive and to get rid of any misapprehensions or prejudices that people can easily fall into. And also because it's just lovely going on the tunnelbana as you're going shopping in Stockholm and knowing what people are saying around you, because it's a pretty odd feeling sitting on a train with no idea what anybody's saying. So I did learn the language. I have various different sort of attempts at it, and it really helped me a lot, and I really enjoyed it. I think that obviously all different nationalities have very different DNA, and they have different ways of operating. And there are some things that can feel quite shocking or quite strange, or just something you haven't come across before. And I think you have to go through a sort of process of stripping back, you know, your very Britishness or what you're used to. And just thinking, okay, well, it's fine. People just, you know, they do it a different way. If they come for supper, perhaps they don't write a note the next day. Perhaps they use the phone in a different way. Manners are maybe different. Lots and lots of different things. But it's fine. I think you just have to take people at face value and let friendships develop and not be held back by what you've always been accustomed to. And I think also that when you're living as an expat, you're in a very sort of compressed world, because people are there for a short time frame. And I think that's hugely exciting, because it means that people want to adventure and they want to discover things. Certainly a difference I found with being back in England is that everybody lives as if they're going to live forever. And they perhaps don't go and see things, or they don't do things because they've always lived in the same area, or they think, well, I can do that next year or in 10 years' time, it doesn't really matter. But when you're an expat, you really should live every day as if it might be your last, because time is hugely precious and there are all these discoveries that you can make. So I think that gives the experience of being an expat its own vim and energy, which is really exciting. So all of these experiences I've tried to sum up in So Sweden, Living Differently. I wrote the book because, perhaps counter to what I expected, when we came back from Sweden, people were really fascinated by what we'd done. And I found myself telling these stories endlessly, which was lovely for me to remember everything. But I was very touched and taken by the fact that people were truly interested in Sweden. And I've also been struck by the fact, and I was even before we moved there, that very, very little has been written about Sweden, either with the expat in mind or per se. Of course, there's been an increasing amount of fiction and all of the sort of mystery stories about Sweden. But not many people have really tried to get under the skin of a country which I think more and more is fascinating people, and which has a particular model that people really want to follow, or they want to understand what's at the bottom of it, and that has created such a rich and peaceful country with such an amazing welfare state. And I think also now, here we are in 2020, something that's particularly noticeable is that Sweden is again sort of at the forefront of the environmental agenda. And because it's so close to nature and it's such a pure country, I think it has a lot of lessons for us to learn. So I hope very much that you might enjoy reading my book, and that it will give you some inspiration and some reassurance and some guidance as you perhaps spend time in Sweden. And it'll be a sort of key to helping you get the most out of the country and the challenge of being an expat.
Thank you so much, Alison, for sharing everything with us, and good luck with your book.
Thank you very much, and happy reading.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.